Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the 26th meeting of 2019 of the Social Security Committee. Can I remind everyone present to turn off mobile phones or other devices to silent mode so the meeting does not get disturbed. With an apology from our Vice Convener Pauline McNeill, who can't be with us this morning. Our best wishes go to Pauline. Before we move to agenda item 1, however, I would like to put something on the record. I'd like to thank the individuals and organisations that took time to speak to our committee at a recent visit to Wester Hailes Education Centre. The visit was extremely worthwhile and what we heard was insightful and will be carried through into our inquiry on benefit uptake. We were given 3 specific issues they raised with us, which we promised to take forward. So at the earliest opportunity, we'd like to put that on the record this morning before we go to the formal agenda items. The 3 examples were about people experiencing issues which were negative in relation to claiming benefit. Those were the income threshold for carers allowance not having increased since the increase of the minimum wage and the issues that was causing. It was student loans being treated as income in universal credit, the issues that was causing, and tax rebates for work undertaken before a person moved to universal credit being treated as income for an assessment period and reducing the universal credit payable. I committed as the convener of this committee that I would raise these 3 issues with the UK Government at the earliest opportunity, and we'll seek to do that once a new UK Government has been formed. It's important when we do this kind of engagement as a committee that we put concerns on the record at the earliest opportunity and we take forward those concerns, hence why I was doing that this morning. So we now move to agenda item 1, which is decision to take items in private. The committee is asked to agree that item 5, consideration of evidence, is taken in private. Is the committee agreed? Thank you very much. Moving to agenda item 2 now, subordinate legislation. The committee will take evidence on the Scotland Act 1998, transfer of functions to the Scottish Ministers, etc., Order 2020 in draft form, which is subject to the affirmative procedure. And can I welcome this morning Shirley-Ann Somerville, Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary.
Good morning. And
can I also welcome Colin Brown, Senior Principal Legal Officer, and Chris Graham, Unit Head, Low Income Benefits Policy Unit, Scottish Government. Thank you, both of you gentlemen, for coming along this morning. And good morning. This order simply enables Scottish Ministers to share with the Secretary of State existing powers related to employment support. It does not give Ministers any legislative competence. As such, the job grant scheme will be delivered administratively. No further Scottish regulations are required. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement and then we'll move to questions. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. The draft order today sets out the high-level limits for the eligibility rules for the Job Start Payment Assistance. It does not set out the rules for payments, it describes the limits on those rules. Those limits relate principally to the age of an eligible applicant and the requirement that they have been unemployed for 6 months. If agreed, Job Start payment will be delivered by Social Security Scotland and help eligible young people with the costs associated with starting a new job. Powers relating to employment or training are mainly reserved to the UK Government, and that is why this order made under Section 63 of the Scotland Act 1998 is needed. The Scotland Act requires that this order be subject to affirmative resolution in both Houses of Parliament and in the Scottish Parliament. This order was laid in the UK and Scottish Parliaments on the 31st of October. We anticipate that it will be debated in Westminster in the new year, though the exact timing may depend on the outcome of December's general election. It will then require to be made by Her Majesty at the Privy Council, and we hope that this can take place in either February or March. If approval is given by both Parliaments and the order is made, it will grant Scottish Ministers powers to arrange assistance under Section 2 of the Employment and Training Act 1973. We will then put the rest of the necessary legal framework in place to launch Job Start payment in spring 2020. This commitment was made in our programme for government. Any payments made under Section 2 of the 1973 Act are administrative in nature, and the detailed arrangements will be set out in operational guidance. This differs from the arrangements for most other benefits that are being delivered by Social Security Scotland, which are set out in regulations made under the Social Security Scotland Act 2018. This is a result of how the 1973 Act operates. It does not give regulation-making powers. That has some disadvantages, but it will allow us to swiftly introduce payments once we have the powers. The draft order also provides for the requisite information sharing powers. This relates to the sharing of revenue and customs information and social security information with Scottish ministers. This is necessary to enable Social Security Scotland to check existing benefit awards in order to verify eligibility for this new payment. It is worth noting that the order gives shared powers, so nothing in it will reduce the powers of the Secretary of State to make payments in this area. Finally, Convener, I would like to express my appreciation to the Scotland Office and to the Office of the Advocate General. Their contributions have helped shape the order and have ensured that it can be laid prior to December's general election, and I very much appreciate the joint working that has gone on between both governments on this issue. Convener, I hope you will agree that this order is a sensible use of powers under the Scotland Act and a practical result that will be welcomed. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Are there any questions? We'll take Shona Robertson, then Alison Johnson.
Thank you. Good morning. Just whether you could say a little bit more about, I know it's only administrative responsibility, but if you could say a little bit more about how the Job Start payment's going to relate to the Fair Start Scotland assistance, because clearly they're both in the same sort of area in terms of helping people back to work. So has there been any detailed discussions around how those two benefits will relate to one another going forward?
Well, there's certainly been a great deal of work that's gone on between Social Security officials and officials that are under Jamie Hepburn's portfolio. Indeed, I think I launched the consultation at a Fair Start office, and the discussions that I had there and that officials have been having is to obviously ensure that everybody is aware of the benefit, that people are aware about how to apply, who's eligible for it, to ensure that this is seamless. This is assistance for young people once they have an offer of employment, and therefore we're certainly looking very carefully at how we can ensure the take-up, the eligibility is known far and wide, but particularly obviously that is an important aspect of Fair Start, and certainly I'm very content with the work that's been going on between officials in different parts of government to ensure that that is seamless and that there's a good knowledge of what's available for a young person at every opportunity.
Okay. Alison Johnson.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Good morning. I think it's fair to say that Job Start will begin as a less well-known payment, and I'd just be grateful if you could elaborate on what work has been undertaken to ensure that people are aware of it and to encourage take-up of it.
Well, we've undertaken, as I said to Shona Robinson there, a great deal of work, obviously, with what else is going on within government, within our own agencies, to ensure that that's important. I'm also aware that Social Security Scotland are in communication with the DWP, because obviously if they have a young person who's perhaps moving on, and that's through through DWP offices, then it would obviously be of help if we could ensure that that information is getting out at that level. And I'd of course be happy to update the committee further in writing as to how that work is progressing, both within our agencies and also with the DWP. There is of course, as we do with all the benefits, a lot of stakeholder engagement that's been going on to ensure that those who are supporting young people will also know about it. For example, just was one organisation, for example, would be the Prince's Trust, the support that they're delivering to people, and they obviously do a great deal of work for young people who may indeed benefit from that. So as with all the benefits, as the committee is aware, we do absolutely endeavour to ensure that every stakeholder knows about it and encourages the people that they are supporting or that they represent to get involved. Once we've obviously got more detail about when the go-live date will be, and that's not entirely within our gift obviously at this point, then we'll be able to ramp that up even further.
There's slightly different provisions for people who have previously been looked after, and the age of entitlement is set longer to 26 years of age. Has there any work been done specifically to ensure that that group of people are
Absolutely.
aware.
I mean, it's one of the very, very key areas that we're looking at, because there's a specific area of this Job Start payment for people who are leaving care. There's obviously been work with Who Cares Scotland and with other organisations to see how we can develop that. And as I say, once we move forward to an actual go-live date, then that can be increased. But we're absolutely determined. There's no point having that particular part of the Job Start payment if those young people themselves aren't aware of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Are there any other questions? Can I just ask, oh sorry, Keith Brown.
Just very briefly to ask whether, as far as you know, are there counterpoints to this potential benefit in other parts of the UK, maybe in a different guise, or is this fairly unique? And a second question would be around, I think you mentioned Cabinet Secretary, this was using the 1973 Act, which didn't allow regulation-making powers, which seems logical to enable you to do it quickly, but whether that's a question over how it might operate in future, and whether you think that it's difficult as all this has been to do, there's been enough done to make sure this helps simplify the system, or does it further complicate the system? Just to see if there's any work being done on that.
Well, certainly there's no grant that's available, no payment that's available for young people in this way in the rest of the UK. There are certain support provisions that are out there, but they are more onerous and more difficult for a young person to apply for. They may, for example, require a young person to actually include receipts of expenditure, etc., and be able to prove what they've done, rather than a reassurance that a payment is there. So there's nothing available at this point for young people like that. I do appreciate this is in some ways a strange way to make the Job Start payment, because we are referring back to a much older Act, and it does involve some limitations, but that's why the joint working that's been going on between the UK and the Scottish governments to ensure that there's been good communication about what we're wanting to do up here, and the implications that might have for the UK government have been particularly important, and that's why I thought it was important to put that on the record during my opening remarks, that it's simply the only way that we could have done this within the powers that we have at the moment.
Any other questions from members? Cabinet Secretary, can I just ask one question? I'm just looking at the Scottish Government's response to the consultation on job grant, and I was just looking at the theme of disregards. And obviously, at the start of this committee this morning, I had mentioned issues in relation to universal credit before we moved on to the formal agenda. And there were some concerns raised that where a young person's in receipt of universal credit, that the Job Start payment could impact on monies they're absolutely entitled to under universal credit entitlements, and I note that there's ongoing conversations with the DWP and HMRC. I'm just wondering, are you reassured that this issue has been dealt with or will be successfully dealt with?
Well, we'll certainly do everything we can in everything that we're doing within social security to ensure that the money that's given to a young person, or indeed anyone else, doesn't impact on other benefits and so on. I think it would be fair to say, given the fact that young people are therefore moving into employment once they get this payment, it's actually the eligible earnings that they'll be getting from that employment that will impact obviously on their universal credit, rather than it being the payment of this that will tip them over a taper. But certainly everything that we're doing, we absolutely start off with the principle of ensuring that it doesn't impact, if at all possible, on a universal credit or any other passported benefit, for example. But as I say, because of the particular way this payment's made, it's likely to be actually that their eligible earnings will obviously impact on their universal credit.
And one final question, and this isn't meant to sound churlish at all, because this is a positive thing, that young people are getting £250 or £400 to support them into employment, and all the cost pressures around that. Money they'll be getting in Scotland that they would not be getting anywhere else in the UK, so hugely positive. But as you'd expect me to ask, chairing the Social Security Committee, costs increase over time. So when would the government maybe intend reviewing that balance of £250 and £400? And in asking that question, I note the initial consultation was to pay less than that initially, and this is already greater than the initial amount consulted on by the government. But when would you think it would be appropriate to review that level of payment?
Well, obviously, when we review the spending within Social Security within our budgetary discussions, then this would be part of that discussion as we do with every benefit. So it's very important that that's reviewed and considered, but that would be done and as our usual budgetary considerations go forth.
Thank Cabinet Secretary. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions before we move to the next agenda item? Okay. There being no other questions, we now move to agenda item 3 and can invite Ms Somerville to move motion S5M 19843 that the Social Security Committee recommends that the Scotland Act 1998 transfer of functions to the Scottish Minister, etc. Order 2020 draft form be approved. Can I ask you to move that formally?
Formally moved,
Cabinet
Convener.
Secretary. Thank you. Is the committee content to recommend approval of this instrument? Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, thank you and your officials for coming along this morning. And that ends agenda item 3. Can we suspend briefly before we move to agenda item 4? Thank you. To agenda item 4, which is assessing the feasibility of citizens' basic income pilots in Scotland. And following the recent publication of their interim report, the committee will hear from members of the Citizens' Basic Income Feasibility Study Steering Group. Can I welcome Jerry McCartney, Consultant Public Health Medicine, NHS Health Scotland, and Andy White, Tackling Poverty Manager, Glasgow City Council. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Can I also give the apologies of your colleagues, Wendy Harty, Basic Income Project Manager Improvement Service, and Julie McLachlan, Senior Manager, Economic Policy, North Ayrshire Council, who I know did a power of work in relation to this also, but they unfortunately can't be with us this morning, and they have our best wishes. Before we move to questions, I don't know if one of our witnesses wants to make some brief opening observations.
Thanks, Convener. So we're very grateful to the committee to the opportunity to come and speak to you today, and we welcome the interest of the group. As you probably know, we've been asked as a steering group to look at the feasibility of citizens' basic income pilots in Scotland. That's work that has been ongoing for some time now. The group was first formed in November 2017, and we were grateful to receive some money from the Scottish Government as well as resources in kind from the collaborating partners to take that feasibility work forward. We published our interim report just recently, which I'm hoping you'll be aware of. It's an interim report because we're actively seeking feedback from a whole variety of stakeholders, including yourself, in order that we can take any outstanding issues into account as we prepare the final report, which is due to be made available next spring.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll move to some questions then. Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Just a couple of questions. I'd like to explore the rate set, especially using the minimum income standard. I'm aware that you've proposed a a CBI at 2 levels, and that the high level is based on the minimum income standard produced by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So can you tell us a little bit more about why you chose that and what impact you think that might have on how much people would get compared to the current system, and what that might do to tackle poverty?
Sure. Well, I start with this. So the purpose that most of the collaborating partners have looked at, both the local authorities and the Scottish Government, for a citizen's basic income would be about the reduction of poverty. But that obviously needs to be balanced against the feasibility concerns of different rates and levels and eligibility criteria that might be introduced. So in trying to narrow down the vast array of options that I'm sure you'll be aware of, so lots of different think tanks and organisations have different views about how a CBI should be implemented, at what level, and who should be eligible, and how the payments should be made. We had to narrow down the options and seek feedback on a couple of options that we thought were more likely to be able to be progressed. So we centred on 2. The first was a low rate, which would be more akin to the current levels of benefits. And in so doing, we would be interested then in the additional impact that you might get from removing conditionality in the benefit system, which is one of the main proposed benefits of a CBI. So you would not have to prove you're searching for work. You would not have to, undertake additional activities in order to be eligible for CBI. But the second rate that you mentioned that's akin to the minimum income standard, that's a level of income that's been defined by, as you mentioned, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and they've looked at what it costs to live and participate fully in societies. So it's not just about being able to feed your family and clothe yourself, it's also about the ability to participate in social activities and be a full member of society, which is quite a common definition of poverty. And so by trying to peg the higher rate against the minimum income standard, we would hope to vastly reduce poverty if it were to be piloted or implemented.
Thank you. Can I ask too, the report says that the steering group has been engaging with the DWP since April last year. Could you give us a bit of an insight into this engagement? I mean, how much interaction has there been between the group and the UK government?
I think it's fair to say that the interaction with the DWP is not at the stage that this position the steering group would have liked it to have been. The first contact with the DWP, as I think you said, was back in April 2018, and there was also contact with the Scottish Government ministers as well. And as a result of that, the Scottish Government wrote to the DWP Secretary of State, and from that there was a commitment that the DWP officials would be made available to interact with the work of the steering group. There's been one face-to-face meeting with the DWP, and that took place in March 2019. The DWP now have the interim model that we've set out, and we've asked them a range of questions around that, both for the DWP and also HMRC colleagues. And we're planning a face-to-face workshop now to go through the interim model and the questions that certainly we've raised, and of course they will have issues as well. That was due to take place in next month, December, but because of the general election, we're told that it's been, which might be understandable, it's been now moved to January. So we have a date in January where representatives of the steering group will go down to London and have a face-to-face workshop type engagement with the DWP. And hopefully before that we will probably have contact with them in relation to maybe their interim thoughts on the models, or at least the questions that we've asked them in relation to the models. Just in relation to the last question about the issue of poverty, clearly we're setting out 2 rates, and as Jerry says, one of the rates kind of looks at the basic simple subsistence levels you would get within the, first of all, both within the existing legacy system, but also within UC, Universal Credit, and then we look at the the minimum income standard set out by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. You might conclude that the higher level would have a greater impact as far as tackling poverty is concerned, and indeed with some of the other work that we're doing in relation to economic modelling of the options, it's likely that that would be said. But I don't think even looking at the low level, we should underestimate the possible impact that could have on tackling poverty as well, because one of the things that some people say are having an impact on an increase in child poverty is the current two-child policy in relation to both tax credits and universal credit. And our model within a CBI, even at the low level, wouldn't have a cap on payment as far as the number of children are concerned.
I suppose I think you've both made that point well, the fact that it's non-conditional, it just takes away the stress and means that more people are going to get it. So even if it's at a lower level, it can have a bigger impact. Just to probe a little bit further, if I might, Convener, I mean, obviously, if you're setting up a pilot that may substitute existing benefits or whatever, you're going to need to be working with HMRC and the DWP. You obviously need access to data and so on. So it would seem that it is imperative that the relationship with the DWP and the ability to meet and progress things is absolutely key.
Yes, and as someone within the steering group who's perhaps doing quite a bit of work in relation to the benefit interaction, I'm very, very keen that we have the meeting with the DWP. I hope you see from the interim report that we are very conscious that we want to look at CBI and bring it to the reality of the other benefits that it would have to continue to interact with. You know, I think most advocates of CBI say it still have to interact with the disability benefits system, although clearly that's changing to an extent in Scotland. Housing costs, childcare costs, limited capability, and really what we're keen to do is propose a pilot model that interacts well with the systems that would be remaining, because we don't want to propose anything that would see people end up in detriment.
Thank you, Convener.
Really interesting line of questioning, particularly in relation to existing UK benefits, and I get that kind of overlapping now between UK benefits, devolved Scottish benefits, and benefits that are operating under agency agreements at a UK level as well. A note from the paper we've got that it's recommended current payments such as disability, work capability, childcare and housing elements would not be impacted by a citizen's basic income, but there would be elements of the following removed, such as income-related GISA, income-related ESA, pension credit guarantee, which we'll come back to in more detail in a second, and child benefit. So clearly it's critical there's a discussion in relation to how that works with the UK government. I'm conscious the fiscal framework's about to be renegotiated as well. One thing our committee has been focused on is unintended consequences where an investment in Scotland for a citizen's basic income doesn't have a clawback effect, whether on an individual in receipt of benefit or actually on the Scottish finances. So I'm sure we wouldn't want to see a situation where Scotland uses its money to invest in a citizen's basic income, and what it does is displace UK reserve benefits. So have you done a bit more work in relation to that, or does that all wait until you meet DWP, or where does that sit? Because that's the big thing that jumps out, I think, in all of this. I
think to have more meaningful stuff to say around that, the engagement with the DWP and HMRC is crucial to that. I mean, we're very keen as well to say that this is an interim model that we are proposing, and I think even within the steering group, you know, what we wanted to do as far as the low level was concerned is at least replicate the basic subsistence levels. But within the steering group, I think we might have further thoughts on the proposed model. You've mentioned pensions, that might be one example, but really I think the starting point has to be what the DWP's position is, not just in relation to the levels that we are suggesting that are replaced by a CBI. But then if it's having to interact with the legacy or universal credit system, how that payment would be viewed in relation to people's income. Because we don't want to be in a situation where, as I've said, people are in detriment, and equally we want to be able to interact with the remaining systems in a way that people still get the housing costs that they need in relation to their rent, disability costs, etc. So the answer to your question is I don't think we're at the stage to give the level of detail that you're asking for just now, and it is important that we have the DWP response.
So is there an underlying principle, obviously, that individuals that take part in a citizen's basic income would not be at detriment? But would the underlying principle be that the Scottish Exchequer should also not be at detriment in relation to displaced benefits? And that's why I was mentioning the fiscal framework. Jenny McCartney.
Yeah, so it's important just to recognise that what we are doing here is a feasibility study, and how feasible doing a pilot will be depends on not only the engagement with DWP and HMRC, but also the cost implications for the Scottish Government, and these all interact. And so as soon as you move one part of the jigsaw, other things change around as well. So as Andy's mentioned, I mean, this is very much an interim report, and there's negotiations and discussions still ongoing. But having this kind of conversation is very helpful to help focus our minds on the kinds of things that we need to resolve as we move towards a final report.
That's helpful. I use numbers for illustrative purposes only, but if this was to displace £100 million of UK reserve benefits that would otherwise be spent by the UK Exchequer, but then isn't spent because a citizen's basic income displaces that, then you'd want to make sure that the Scottish Exchequer was recompensed for that. So I was just kind of raising that as a more general issue. But I'd mentioned pension credit in my earlier question, and apologies if I've picked this up wrongly, but my understanding is that so the pension credit would be impacted by a citizen's basic income under this potential model, but pensions, with obviously contributions based directly, would not be. And I understand the logic for the latter there. But if you've got a situation where pensioners who are relying on that top up to their income for effectively a minimum income guarantee with pension credit may not be in detriment, but they might not benefit that much. Whereas a pensioner who's got their full contributions based entitlement to their pension then gets, depending on what rate you go for, gets £167.25 or £195.90, would do very well out of it, which is a positive thing. But I suppose my question could be, could an unintended consequence be that it creates inequality between various groups? So could inequalities between different groups of pensioners be exacerbated under the model that's been proposed?
So just one, Andy might be going into more detail in some of the interaction issues, but it's also worth noting that in a pilot scenario, we don't think it's likely that income tax rates would be able to be varied. And so there's a difference between what might be possible in a rollout scenario and a pilot scenario. And the interaction, obviously, between any changes in tax rates to fund a CBI, if it was to be fiscally neutral, would then potentially claw back some of the gains that more affluent groups might get from a CBI. And we're doing econometric modelling that we've commissioned using a large chunk of the money that we received to look at different models of how a CBI could be funded and what the redistributive consequences and the knock-on consequences to the wider economy would be. So you're right to say that the principle of universality means that absolutely everybody gets it, and so rich or poor would benefit in the first round, if you like. But it depends a wee bit on how you then fund that and who bears the tax burden to fund that, and whether other options might be used also to fund it. So these things have as much an impact on the distributive qualities of CBI as does where the payments go.
Yeah, so Andy White, do you want to add anything to that? Just
in relation to your point about potential detriment or winners and losers in the scenario, the low level CBI payment model that we've put together, and I think I've said, is really looking at what could be replaced in relation to what you define as the basic subsistence rate. So clearly pension credit would be the basic subsistence rate in relation to low-income pensioners, and it's in tune with the rest of the model for the other age groups. But I do think, and we kind of say this to an extent within the report, I do think there's a good bit more work to do in relation to how pensions are treated, because in some cases you could see some pensioners are almost getting double the payment of others. If you look at the new state pension and the level that that's set at. So we're going to have a further look at this, and it could be the case that instead of the pension credit being the benefit that we're suggesting is switched off, it could perhaps be the new state pension that switched off, and we look at seeing that, as many people do, as being a basic income unconditional to an extent in relation to those of pension age. And it could also be the case that we look at that and say, well, if that's the starting point, is it about retaining the state pension and looking at perhaps a top-up of that? I mean, these are just some options, and some of it is some options that's in my own head, and it's got to be, I think, the steering group that take the final position on that. But you'll see from the wording of the report that both in relation to pensions and also in relation to how we think the basic elements within working tax credits, for example, are treated, that this is very much our interim position, and we're going to be doing a wee bit more work on it.
That's helpful. Thank you. Shona Robinson.
I was just going to talk about the international experience, but before doing that, the economic metric modelling you talked about, when is that going to be produced?
So we've commissioned a group that includes IPPR and the Fraser Wallander Institute at Strathclyde University. We've seen some interim results, and we had hoped to get a final report by January to include in our final report. We keep asking them to do slightly new things and tweaks, and so we may have to extend that timeline somewhat, but we've still to negotiate that with the wider steering group. We only met with them yesterday, so we've certainly got some interim results, but we're still checking the assumptions and asking them to look at different sensitivity analyses, not least about the kinds of issues that Andy's mentioned in the last answer to the question.
Will you be able to share that with the committee once it's in a place that you're happy with?
Absolutely. So it'll be in the public domain once it's finished.
Okay, that would be helpful. I mean, obviously every system's different, so international comparisons must be quite tricky, because obviously the tax and benefit system is different. They're moving from a different point to a different point from where we are. They're not having to necessarily negotiate between two governments. But nevertheless, it would be helpful to know how much international experience you've been able to draw on, particularly around the taxation system of presumably part funding by clawing back through taxation. Those who are more affluent, who would be receiving the income, would therefore pay an element back in taxation. So where has been the most fruitful place that you've looked at?
So it's a really good question, and there's a lot of work that has been done in that arena. So the main approach of the steering group has been twofold. So we've participated in a big international conference called BN, the Basic Income Earth Network Conference, which brings together people with an interest, academics with interest in basic income type interventions, and we've been interacting with the networks around that. Get a lot of correspondence from others wanting to learn from us, and vice versa. And through that, we've had a lot of contact, for example, with the people who ran the pilot in Finland and the pilot in Ontario. We've also, and I say we as the royal we, so Wendy Harty, who's not able to be with us today, was one of the authors of a large scoping review that was done with What Works Scotland and the University of Glasgow, which synthesises the literature from previous basic income experiments from across the world and across time. And I'm sure the committee will be aware that there's a long, long history of such experiments going back to some of the work in Gary, Indiana, in various towns across the USA, the Alaskan experiment, and there's been more recent ones as well, which are still to generate evidence, for example, from the Netherlands. I could run through some of the key learning, I guess, that we've drawn out from that. So it's very important to be clear what the aim of a basic income pilot is. So, for example, in the Finnish experiment, the aim was very much about helping people back into work. And so the only eligible group were people who were on unemployment benefits. So it wasn't universal in the same way that we're discussing with the Scottish work. And so different pilots and different interventions across the world have very different aims and very different scopes. And so being clear about that is really important. We're also keen to learn about the need to get a broad level of support across society for piloting. We've seen a number of experiments where the learning has been lost because the experiments have finished early. So, for example, in Ontario, there was a change of government and the experiment didn't get finished. And so a lot of the learning and the research was lost. So it's important that there's broad agreement about undertaking pilots and seeing that through to then so that the research can be completed. There's quite a lot of learning around the design. So in some pilots, it's been undertaken more at local level, so by municipalities rather than by national governments. And that has limited the scope that they've had to switch on and off benefits and change conditionality. And again, if that's one of the key aims of a pilot, then it needs to have it has to have political implementation, I guess, at the right level. There's been quite a lot of learning about the impacts on some particular groups. So there's been a lot of interest, for example, in the labour market and whether people are more or less likely to withdraw from the labour market if they receive an income. What we see from the evidence is largely that where that does happen, the effect is small, and it's often in people who want to stay on in education for longer and improve their skills, which has led to some interest around the potential for increased productivity in the future. So there's some learning around that, although again, the degree to which that's generalisable from some of the pilots that took place maybe 30 or 40 years ago might be more limited, and particularly when they're coming from a North American context. The last thing I think that we need to learn is the importance of clear communications around this. So again, in the Finnish pilots, what often happened was the global media descended on individuals and small communities where piloting was taking place. And that obviously created a lot of stress and pressure for people who were as part of the pilots. But it also might have interfered with the true effects of any pilot as other things were going on, including this sort of media attention. So we need to take care around all of these factors if we were to go ahead with piloting in Scotland.
Thank you.
Any more questions, Shona?
No, that's fine, thanks.
Okay, Jeremy Balfour.
And good morning. I suppose it'd be interesting just to get a wee bit of reflection on what we're learning from each different 4 local authority areas. Are there differentials just because of where we are? And how is the communication between the 4 studies? Is it are they talking? Are you making sure they talk to each other? Are they sharing information? Just to see where we are at.
Thank you. So just to be clear, that there aren't 4 studies. So we're all working together across the 4 local authorities. The Scottish Government are represented, the Improvement Service are represented, which obviously has a pan-Scotland local authority role, as well as NHS Health Scotland, my own organisation, providing a lot of the evaluation support. So there aren't any studies in play at the moment. All we're doing is looking at the feasibility in collaboration, and as such, all of the work is joint. However, what is brought together by the 4 local authorities is obviously different local challenges and different demographics across areas. So one of the questions that has come up in the interim report is whether there would be interest in piloting in both an urban and a rural area, and in a deprived and a less deprived area. Obviously, it would be possible to get a kind of composite, a compromise kind of area with moderate levels of all of those different factors. But to get true community level effects, which is something we're quite interested in, so this potential for volunteering and social capital and other factors to arise from a CBI being implemented, we would want natural communities to be part of the pilot, which is one of the reasons why we wouldn't want to pilot at just individual level, so a scattering of people across Scotland. We want to have a sort of critical mass of people alongside one another to see if these community level effects do arise. And clearly that might happen differently in urban and rural areas, and it might happen differently in affluent and deprived. So one of the questions, I guess, one of the things we're keen to get feedback on is whether there's interest in doing that. Clearly doing more than one pilot area increases the cost. So there's a trade-off there between the potential costs of any pilot, but also what you might learn from the differential impacts in different sorts of areas.
I think I'm right in saying, I think you suggest, well, it's a 3-year study. I think it's a year before to get everything organised. And then presumably it will be another year, 2 years to analyse the work. So even if we press the button on this on the 1st of January, we're looking at, what, 6-7 years before a final recommendation would be coming before Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament. Is that the time? I'm just trying to get my head around the time scales around this. Is that roughly right?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is that we're some way off. So obviously all the feasibility work would need to be done. But if we were at the point of starting, then yes, there would be. We're suggesting that we would need a year to get things ready. So one of the main purposes of piloting is obviously to learn from what the impact is, because there are so many uncertainties. And to do that well, we have to make sure the pilot is valuable, so we're able to gather as much information as possible. That means collecting data from both the intervention populations but also comparison populations, so that any secular trend, any trends over time that are happening in the general population can be adjusted away from. So collecting all that data and designing the surveys and implementing all of that takes some time. So we would want a year preparatory time for that. It would be possible to run pilots for shorter or longer periods of time. We're suggesting 3 years because anything shorter might be too small a time period for people to perhaps take advantage of CBI. So, for example, if you were to make a decision that I'm going to use the CBI to go and retrain or to start a business or to whatever it happens to be, if you're only guaranteed that CBI for, say, 6 months or a year or a shorter period, people will be less likely to make that change. But obviously, if you were to implement it for 10 years or 20 years, that's too long to wait to find out what the impacts are. So 3 years is a kind of compromise based on what evidence we've got available, but I wouldn't say that that's a fixed length of time. And then you're right, we would need some time to analyse the data afterwards, and something like a year or two would be a reasonable estimate of that at the moment. Although, if that's something important, we can try and clarify that more in the final report.
And just my final question around this is just on timescales is, when do you think realistically you'd be ready, with the local, if whatever area you decide to go for, to get that local authority personnel in place, to get everything, if Scottish Government came to you and said, when can you push the button? What would be a realistic timescale?
So obviously the stage we're at the moment is exploring the feasibility, and we've already discussed some of the aspects that make things less feasible. So we do need to be really clear about the benefit interactions and the tax interactions, and all of that would need to be clearly resolved before we would recommend to ministers and others that we're ready to pilot. So if all of that was to be resolved, I think a year's period would be probably long enough to get things in place from that decision point. But I think there's quite a lot of work to be done before we could get to that decision point.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, can I just a very brief question? It's obviously an area-based approach that a pilot would be taken. Now, I think all the politicians, those who were knocking doors, were constituencies at the general election. Some areas have quite a high churn and turnover of households moving in and out of the area. Under any pilot, what would happen if a family was to move out that area to another area, or another family was to move in? would it be the cohort at when you press the button, as Jeremy Balfour took it, that kept with the citizens' basic income, or would there be new additions as folk moved into an area? Just wondering, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so the proposal we've got at the moment is that everybody who would be resident on day one would get it, and they would retain it no matter where they ended up. But also people who arrived into the area would also get it. And that's because it will give us some natural experimentation in that. So how important is it to be part of the community? It doesn't matter if you move away. It would be, I think, unfair if somebody had started on it and then for whatever reason they had to move, and that would to be withdrawn from them. But it would also be unfair to new incomers to an area if you're trying to generate those community level effects, if that became diluted over time. Clearly there are other options that could be pursued, and it would depend on how much churn within communities there are that could influence decisions around that. But that's our interim position. Again, if there was feedback on that, we would very much welcome it.
Really interesting, given the fact my constituency can identify areas with lots of void properties or hard-to-let properties, of clusters of temporary accommodation, and just what the impact and the behavioural impact would be in relation to that would be really fascinating. So that's interesting. We'll move to the next question. Mark Griffin.
Thanks, Convener. I wanted to explore areas around consent for participants, and I know the report has left this open to a certain extent, and the report talks about whether actual consent is real or not when existing benefits are withdrawn. Effectively, participants with no means are forced onto it. Just ask for whether there's been any further discussions on whether you think a pilot would be mandatory or voluntary.
So there's two aspects to consent here. So there's first is consent to participate in the pilot, and then there's consent to participate in the evaluation. So the evaluation question's easier, and so I'll deal with that first. So in part of an evaluation, obviously we collect data from people in the same way that the Scottish Household Survey or the Scottish Health Survey or other surveys collect data, and so to collect that new data from people, they would need to actively consent. And so I think we're saying that you would need to have informed, active consent to participate in the evaluation, and that would be true of both the intervention areas and any comparison populations. In terms of consent to participate in the pilot, you're right to raise this as an issue that we've been discussing at length within the steering group, and I think it does raise lots of issues. So, as you've already noted, changes are made quite frequently within the social security system, and recipients of those benefits aren't asked for consent to do that. But this is a slightly different proposition, given that it's very much a pilot and it's also set in a sort of social research context. It would depend on the basis on which it was being introduced and piloted. If it was more on the research side, then I think consent would be more important. If it's more a policy pilot, then consent might be less necessary. What's more, if we are able to guarantee no detriment, then I think we'd be much more confident about not needing to pursue consent. And I think this is a simpler issue in a pilot scenario as well, because we're not proposing changes in the tax rates, which clearly people might be more inclined to opt out of if they had the opportunity to. So I think all of those considerations are still live and real, and we're still perhaps not a final position on all of that. But I think you're right to raise that as an issue, and hopefully I've articulated our thinking at the moment.
I think you've touched on one of the key points is about whether the pilot can or can't offer a guarantee of no detriment, and we know how difficult that can be in terms of not just through the pilot project maintaining no detriment, but maintaining no detriment after a potential pilot. And just for the steering group's views on whether you feel it would be right to introduce a mandatory pilot where no detriment couldn't be fully guaranteed.
Yep. So you're right to raise, and I'm glad you've raised the point about getting people on and off any particular pilot safely and in a position of no detriment, because clearly at the end of any pilot, if it weren't to be continued or if it wasn't to be rolled out, those participants would then go back on the legacy system. And with people moving between legacy and the legacy system and universal credit, there's all sorts of implications of that for people that we need to be very careful of. Much of this depends on the negotiations and the agreements that we can come to with the DWP and HMRC around this. And our report that we commissioned from the Child Poverty Action Group looked in detail about the potential areas that we needed to look at to avoid no detriment. And they were certainly keen for us to look at some of those areas in more detail, and Andy and colleagues have been doing that to try and minimise those risks. I think we would want to be in the position of saying that participants would be in the position of no detriment, but we might need to put in additional provisions to make that guarantee absolute, because of the complexity of some household structures that make a simple arithmetical calculation of that quite difficult to guarantee absolutely.
And I think also the universal credit world, you know, people migrating from legacy benefits onto UC and going with them a degree of protection, be it in relation to their disability premiums or just a transitional protection in general, because their entitlement on legacy benefits is going to be is higher than it's going to be under UC. So it's about teasing those issues out with the DWP as well, to get guarantees that people's transitional protection wouldn't disappear if they ended up off of universal credit, for example, for a period because they were participating in the pilot scheme. So it's an area that, you know, we've mapped out loads of potential detriment, not because we want to be negative, but because we really want to do due diligence on this matter. And also within the steering group, we have a subgroup that looks at transitions, so it'd look at the support that people would potentially need in relation to going on to the pilot at the start, during the pilot, and then coming off the pilot too. But, you know, being keen to ensure that any potential support doesn't act as an intervention on its own that might shape behaviour that then it'd be difficult to work out if it was the CBI payment that, or regime that had that effect, and it wasn't the additional support or intervention. So again, as Jerry said, you know, it's a good question, and you know, it's one that we're particularly doing a piece of work on, and very conscious that we need to get right.
So is it your intention then to try and seek agreement from DWP, HMRC, Social Security Scotland, that at the end of a potential pilot, and that they would support anyone coming off the pilot to ensure no detriment in the future after a potential pilot?
We've set out a range of questions to the DWP, but you're also right, there could be additional questions in relation to the Scottish Government, but I think the focus just now is on the DWP that does just what you've highlighted there. So, and how we then go forward with a potential final model in the report will really be shaped by the answers we get to those questions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Alistair Allen.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you could maybe just offer your own assessment of the model itself, and how close you feel it is to what you might call full CBI.
Of course, I'll try. So, most of the advocates of citizens' basic incomes want them to be regular, individually paid, universal, unconditional, and basic. And to that extent, the models that we're proposing meet those criteria, and so would be fairly close to that full model. The bit that a pilot wouldn't be able to look at is the changes to the tax system that would be required to fund it, particularly at the higher level, which would be more expensive. And so in that sense, a pilot would be less true to what would be possible to be rolled out. So I think there's a balance to be struck there.
Again, in answer to your question, I think it does as best we can within the trying to have it continue to interact with the existing systems. Clearly, the characteristic of being unconditional is difficult when we say that, but CBI wouldn't replace disability benefits, it wouldn't replace ESA, the limited capability for work or work-related activity. Clearly, there's even conditionality around your entitlement to housing costs as well. So I think that's where the difficulty arises. Two things. One, what's the DWP going to allow to be switched off? And two, you know, how can we guarantee there's no conditionality when we are saying that it has to interact with these other benefits?
In terms of what you can learn, you've mentioned obviously the tax system going essentially unchanged. In terms of what you can learn from the model, does that compromise that in any way? Or?
Yes, it does. So there'll be a number of things that will be easier to learn from a pilot scenario, and some things that will be more difficult. So the income distribution consequences will be more difficult to learn about, but that's why we're doing the econometric modelling that we mentioned earlier on, which will give us a better picture of what the gross economy impacts of CBI would be were it to be rolled out. And so used alongside that, the evidence gathered through a pilot would be really useful. So we would hope to, we've got quite a large range of outcomes that we're interested in. There are health outcomes, social outcomes, labour market outcomes, people's propensity to volunteer, to set up new businesses. There's a whole range of things that are of interest to the various stakeholders, and we would hope to learn all about that. We would also hope to do a number of qualitative studies alongside to get better insights into sort of unintended consequences or unexpected things, and that might even allow us to design studies as we go along to better capture those kinds of things.
So one of the other things that people look from a CBI is simplification, and given the limitations that you just described, there's probably not going to be the simplification that you would get in Finland, let's suggest. So, but nonetheless, are there things that you can point to or learn for policy makers in the future about how the system might be simplified?
I mean, so obviously some aspects would be simplified. So the aspects of the benefit system that would be turned off for a CBI would, in a sense, pull those benefits into a CBI. So there'll be some aspects of simplification, but you're right that in order to avoid no detriment, it's that trade-off about retaining other benefits around disabilities, housing costs and what have you. So I think there's a trade-off to be made there, and we've been very mindful about the no detriment principle, and I think that's probably trumped some of the decisions that we could have made around perhaps greater simplification, but some people would have come out much worse off as a result.
And finally, to pick up on the point that Jeremy Balfour made as well, the choice of the 4 areas, are you satisfied that that will give you a varied enough picture of the country? I'm afraid, coming from the Western Isles, my standards for rurality and remoteness are extremely high. I don't consider the part of the Western Isles I live in to be either. So I notice that there are some remote areas, obviously like the Isle of Arran, I think would be covered in your 4 areas that you're talking about. But is there enough variety in the 4 areas that have been chosen? So
to be clear, we've not chosen any areas for pilot sites. What we are doing is working with 4 local authorities.
I meant the 4 local authorities.
No, it's okay, but I think there's a risk of confusion here. So we're working with 4 local authorities to look at the feasibility of pilots, and the models and the means of selecting pilot areas should be applicable to the whole of Scotland, and it will be for ministers and others to make decisions if it's feasible and if they want to progress to pilots, whether they're content with searching for areas probably based on criteria around how valuable and comparable areas would be, and what learning could be gained from that, and then we would select areas on that basis. So I wouldn't make the assumption at the moment that any pilots would be within those 4 local authority areas.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Keith Brown.
Yes, post a continuation of that theme. Obviously, you're charged with looking at the feasibility of a scheme. I suppose I'm concerned about the utility of any scheme, what it might actually produce, and you're having to wrestle with some really difficult issues around consent, about what's possible in terms of the tax and the benefit system and so on. And it's a bit like clearing the undergrowth, so you can have a proper seeding of something new and see how it works. And to that extent, it seems to me that one issue you're going to have to look at is the utility of whatever you propose. Is it going to actually tell us stuff at the end of it? And is it just my perception, or is it not the case that, for example, There's a couple of elements to this, but one would be that both governments really have to go all in for this. I mean, that's going to give you the biggest or the clearest chance of finding whether it's going to work in future. And if it's the case that either government doesn't provide that, so because of the tax complications that have been mentioned, that you don't get the simplification that Alistair Allen talked about, really, are you not likely to end up in a kind of dead end where it's a kind of compromise, but it doesn't really tell you anything at the end of it?
So this is exactly why we've been asked to look at the feasibility. So if we look at the best pilot that we could do and we list what we would learn, but what would confuse the effects, what would muddy the waters, what would make it difficult to learn from it, and we lay those things out, that'll help us to make a recommendation about the degree to which a pilot is justified. Obviously, piloting will be expensive, but it's got to be traded off with what we could learn and what possibility that opens up. And the more we can learn, then the clearer the learning from that would be, the more likely that piloting would be a recommendation that we would make. But if it's just not feasible for whatever reason, then, and indeed if the learning that was to be coming from a pilot would be so unclear that it wouldn't generate the utility you're mentioning, then yeah, we might well recommend that actually a pilot's not worthwhile at this point in time.
And just on that, the issue of location and demographics of a location of a pilot, I represent part of Stirling and Clackmannanshire. Clackmannanshire being the smallest local authority in Scotland. It's got higher deprivation levels per capita than most other authorities, but also pockets of affluence. But even there, the issue that the convener mentioned of movement between, say, Clackmannanshire, in my case, and Stirling, or families which are partly located there, and they're quite mobile between the two, presumably produces a limitation on the efficacy, as does the 3-year thing, because even at 3 years, and unlike, I suppose, Jeremy Balfour, I think this is about long-term change in society and how we cope with it in future, so taking some time to do it doesn't really worry me so much. But even 3 years, is it not possible that people will change the behaviour in terms of moving around to take advantage one way or the other, if they see there's a detriment to opt out, if they see there's a benefit to opt in, I suppose? Is 3 years a kind of optimum time for?
It's a trade-off again. So I think the learning we've had from some of the international studies is that if you're not producing useful results after a reasonable period of time, the pilots end and a lot of the learning gets lost because you've perhaps not done the final survey or done the final data collection to allow you to really get the learning and the utility that you're interested in. So I think there's always a risk if the pilot was to be very elongated that we might lose some of that learning. That said, there might be other options about, for example, piloting for an initial 3-year period, perhaps with an option for extending, and we could perhaps collect data, you know, at that 3-year point and say, well, okay, this is what's happened thus far. Would you like to continue this? There are also options to use something called data linkage to follow people up over a longer period of time. But of course, they would only receive the basic income for those 3 years, and whether they would retain any changes in their outcomes when their benefits change back to the previous system is a bit more doubtful, and again, it confuses effects. So I think the points you make are absolutely real, and hopefully we'll reflect on those and reflect those back in the final report.
And last point, can you just say that 3 years, I'm just thinking about some of the benefits potential benefits that haven't been mentioned as yet. So I think productivity was mentioned, but also educational attainment, health outcomes, economic activity, levels of unemployment. It's just, even 3 years, it's going to have a limiting effect on your ability to gauge those kind of changes, I suppose. Yep.
Yep.
That was nodding heads there. Michelle Valentine.
Good morning. It's a really interesting report, actually, and it does cover, and I think Keith Brown's just touched on the issues around that long-term sustainable change that you may or may not get through this kind of massive potential change to the way we deliver support to our society. But one of the things, obviously, as a feasibility, presumably you're looking at whether it would have a sustainable effect, because I noted in the report that you talked about the current pilots that are underway across the world internationally and the interest that's in that. But my understanding is most of those have ended now. They've either been ended early because for various reasons, but there don't seem to be many that have actually managed to sustain through a pilot. to deliver the kind of results you've just talked about, you know, that interrupted data collection that doesn't give you the depth. So I wonder if you could just sort of talk a little bit about that, because obviously your interim report seems to have cut before they have. And the second side is obviously the ultimate sustainability of whether, even if a pilot looks good, is going to be on financial deliverability for any government. And, you know, looking at the numbers there, I wondered, you talked earlier about the recovery rate through income tax, you know, and how it would be affordable. So, you know, the replacement of benefits, the recovery rate through income tax. But I wondered if any thought had been given to where that would sit, because you've talked about the basic income levels, but if you have somebody, say, on 40,000, they get the universal income of 20,000, are you looking to recover the whole of that 20,000 through income tax? In which case it would be a 50% rate, you know, I'm using rounded figures, to claw that back. Has any thought been given to that? Because ultimately, as part of the feasibility, whether we go into a pilot, must, I presume, have some weight around whether realistically it would be deliverable going forward.
Yeah, so if I take your last point first, so the financial deliverability of a pilot it's got to be distinguished from a potential rollout scenario, but they're related but different. So clearly a pilot scenario could be costly, and it depends on how many areas and the levels, etc. The negotiations with the DWP and HMRC are also important here, because obviously some of those benefits are paid by the UK government, and there's a question about if they are being replaced, would that money be recycled back to the Scottish government to pay for the CBI, or would that be retained? And that clearly changes the maths about how affordable a pilot scenario would be. In terms of the long-run financial deliverability, it's likely that tax changes would be required to fund it, and that's where a pilot scenario couldn't actually look at that in any scenario. So even if we were able to vary tax rates for those individuals, it doesn't really tell you about the knock-on consequences for the economy. And so the best way to approach that is through the econometric modelling, which seems to come up a lot this morning. But we're putting quite a lot of faith in that, I guess, that we're able to look at a number of different scenarios about how this could be funded and what the knock-on consequences for the distribution of income would be, and also for GDP and employment rates in the future. Obviously, all modelling comes with assumptions, and you can vary those assumptions, but that will all be transparent and it'll be shared with the public once that's ready. To think about your first point about the sustainability of pilots, so you're right that the evidence we're drawing from at the moment are pilots that are finished, but there are quite a large number of pilots now underway across the world as well, and obviously it will be to be seen whether they are sustained or not. Some of the rationale for pilots being stopped is just simply that they'd run their course. So the Finnish pilot, for example, was planned for 2 years, it ran for 2 years, it finished at 2 years, the learning was gained, and you know, that's what was expected. There was a change of government that didn't support a rollout scenario, and you know, so that was fine. Other scenarios have seen perhaps philanthropic organisations running pilots, which again is a less sustainable model for it being rolled out. So the purpose was more about generating some learning and perhaps creating some interest in the policy idea. Other times, perhaps it's been introduced by municipality level and they've not had the ability to roll it out or sustain it. Quite commonly in the North American pilots, there's been changes in government, and that's meant that the pilots have been stopped at that point of changing government, and sometimes the learning has been able to be captured and sometimes not. In the most recent pilot in Ontario, a lot of the learning was lost because it was stopped early. So I could go back to my earlier point that if, I suppose one of the feasibility considerations is whether there's a broad enough level of support across the political parties, but also civil society and others to support pilots being seen through to the end so that that learning can be gained. And if there isn't that support, then that would diminish the feasibility and the utility of any pilots.
Do you think any of the pilots have demonstrated that it is workable on the ground? And if so, having demonstrated that, why haven't they been picked up, do you think, by governments?
So in terms of workable, and do you mean whether they can be implemented, or do you mean have they
deliverable
had...
within the country in which they were piloted? Because obviously every country has slightly different circumstances, but as you say, there's a lot of pilots being run, tested, but as yet nobody has actually run a pilot and said, yeah, this is great, we're going to to go with this. Why do you think that is?
Well, there are some examples where basic income type policies still exist. So Alaska's the famous one, which is run off a sort of sovereign wealth fund type model. It's at a lower level. It's perhaps not that comparable to what we're growing, but there are some examples where it has been maintained for a variety of different reasons. Each of the pilots that I'm aware of, and it's a shame some of our colleagues aren't able to be here today because they're more familiar with some of this evidence than I am, but the pilots I'm aware of have all managed to be implemented safely and seen through to the end of their pilot, unless there was a change of government over that time. The question really is why it wasn't rolled out. And that, I think, is again just down to political choices and priorities about the extent to which that policy approach was seen to be the right one and the balance of other cost pressures. I suppose one of the frustrations from a research angle is that some of the learning has been lost from some of those pilots, and where we see some quite positive early results from these, it'd be really interesting to see if those were transferable to a Scottish context. Obviously, with the pressures we face around poverty and inequality and health outcomes, productivity and so on and so forth, all of these challenges have been said and proposed to potentially be impacted by CBI, and so it'd be really interesting to see if we saw such an effect in Scotland and were able to collect data on that, if we can find a feasible model.
One more, if that's okay. So if the feasibility shows that a pilot is worth running, and you go to a pilot, what hurdles, what are the main barriers you see to actually delivering a successful pilot that would give us the kind of data that would enable us to decide whether, in fact, this would be a feasible, long-term, sustainable policy for government?
So again, the purpose of a pilot is not to say this will be a perfect policy and it must be rolled out. The purpose of a pilot would be to learn what the impacts are, and then for everybody to judge on the basis of those impacts whether it's worth continuing. So even if we were to find that actually it didn't work, that's useful learning, because then we would know it doesn't work. If we were to find that it did work for whatever outcomes people were interested in, then hopefully we would have collected robust enough data and evidence, and we'll have a comparison group. We'll use very high quality study designs. We'll have planned it in advance. If we've managed to get all of the feasibility ducks in a row, then we will have had enough time to do all of that work, to get the research planned, and to ensure that people get on and off the benefits safely, that people aren't in detriment and so on. And so that gives us the best chance of generating high quality learning. And I think the approach of doing the feasibility study is an excellent opportunity for us to get all of those ducks in a row, so that we're not left with too many uncertainties at the end of any pilot.
So you see it as much as not just about potentially creating a CBI, but as much about feeding into evidence on how to deliver social security.
Absolutely. So it's a pilot. It's a pilot for a reason. So if we knew that this was a great policy and had no downsides and no unintended consequences, then we wouldn't need to pilot it. So that we need to pilot because it's an interesting idea. It's got lots of potential, but we need to evaluate it carefully so that we're sure what those impacts would be.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, all time's almost upon us. Again, just one brief question. I mentioned earlier on about, I mean, we were clear it's a kind of it's a geographical area on a universal basis that will be selected, 4 of them for pilots. And I'd mentioned before, was consideration given to picking groups within society to see how the pilot could operate for them? And I'd just written down, I mentioned kinship carers, I think, beforehand, those living in temporary accommodation, lone parents, and you could pick other groups of people, and you could have a much wider area, but pick a strand of or a section of the community to see how it improves their life chances, their health and their outcomes vis-a-vis if there wasn't a citizen's basic income. Was there thought given to going down that road? Is that ruled out altogether now? Just curious a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we did think about it, and some of the local authorities were particularly keen on that. So care leavers was another example that was raised. And there's a case to be made for all of those groups, and clearly a pilot could be run for that. What you wouldn't gain from that approach, though, is any idea of what those community level impacts would be, and that also seems to be one of the most uncertain impacts of previous basic income type approaches, and also a set of outcomes that's of quite a high degree of interest to the stakeholders that we've spoken to. And on that basis, you can't have your population dispersed like that, so you need to have a concentrated geographical population.
Okay, and just before we move into private session, which we're about to do, I don't know if Mr White or Mr McCartney, there's any final comments you want to make before we move on to the next agenda item?
No, and we welcome the opportunity to come along today. I mean, clearly, as we've tried to highlight, this is an interim report, so we're not saying everything in it is absolutely correct, and it's there for comment. We've asked our stakeholders, stakeholders group that we have, and others to make comment. It's been made publicly available as well, so we certainly would be very interested in any comments that the committee has on it.
Okay, and it's certainly thought-provoking. It's been a really interesting evidence session this morning. So can I thank both of you for your time in giving evidence this morning. That does end agenda item 4. We move to agenda item 5, which we're previously going to take into private session. So now we move into private session. Thank you.